On April 29, 1945, a crowd gathered in Milan's Piazzale Loreto. They had come to see a body, several bodies actually, but one in particular. A heavy-set man in a gray-green uniform, hanging upside down from the roof of a gas station by his ankles, alongside his mistress and 14 other men. The crowd threw things, spat. Some people fired guns into the corpse. A woman fired 5 shots, one for each of her sons killed in the war. At some point, someone took a stick and began beating the face until it was unrecognizable. This was Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, the leader. 20 years earlier, this same city had cheered him through the streets. 20 years earlier, he had stood on balconies and made speeches that sent crowds into ecstasy. He had made the trains run on time, or so the story went. He had drained swamps, built roads, restored Roman glory, invented an ideology that half of Europe would copy. He had been the most powerful man in Italy for 2 decades, and he ended up hanging upside down at a gas station while strangers beat his face with a stick. This is the story of how that happens. Benito Mussolini was born in 1883 in a small village in northern Italy. His father was a blacksmith and a socialist. His mother was a school teacher. He grew up poor, angry, and extraordinarily intelligent, a combination that, in the right circumstances, produces great men. In the wrong circumstances, it produces something else entirely. He became a socialist journalist, a good one. Sharp, provocative, willing to say things that other journalists wouldn't. By his early 30s, he was editing one of Italy's most important socialist newspapers, Avanti, with a circulation of over 100,000. Then the First World War happened, and Mussolini changed his mind. The socialist position was opposition to the war. Italy had no business joining a conflict between empires. Mussolini disagreed. He wanted Italy in the war. He believed war was transformative, purifying, necessary. He wrote editorials saying so. The Socialist Party expelled him. He started his own newspaper, found funding from industrialists who wanted Italy in the war, got what he wanted. Italy entered in 1915. He served, was wounded, came back to a country that was tearing itself apart. Italy in 1919 was a nation in crisis that didn't fully understand it was in crisis. It had fought on the winning side of the war. It had lost 600,000 men. And at the Paris Peace Conference, the great powers, Britain, France, America, gave Italy almost none of the territory it had been promised when it entered the war. Italians called it the mutilated victory. They had paid in blood and received almost nothing. The economy was collapsing. Strikes paralyzed industry. Socialist and communist movements were growing rapidly, talking about revolution. The middle class, shopkeepers, small business owners, war veterans, was terrified. The existing political parties seemed incapable of responding to any of it. Into this chaos walked Mussolini. In March 1919, he founded the Fasci di Combattimento, the combat leagues. The symbol was the fasces, a bundle of rods with an axe, an ancient Roman symbol of authority. The name would give the world a new word, fascism. The movement was not initially coherent. It was anti-socialist, anti-communist, nationalist, and violent. That was enough. Mussolini organized squads of veterans, the black shirts, who attacked socialist offices, beat up labor organizers, burned down newspaper buildings. He called it direct action. The police largely looked the other way. Industrialists funded it. Landowners welcomed it. By 1921, the Fascist Party had 35 seats in parliament. By 1922, Mussolini was ready for something bigger. The March on Rome is remembered as a coup. It was actually a bluff. In October 1922, Mussolini organized columns of black shirts to march on Rome from several directions simultaneously. The plan was to seize the government by force if necessary. In practice, the columns were poorly organized, poorly armed, and would have been stopped easily by the Italian army if ordered to do so. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, could have given that order. His generals told him the army was ready. He hesitated. He worried about civil war. He worried about what would happen if the fascists fought back. He decided the safer option was to invite Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini was in Milan when he got the call. He took a sleeper train to Rome. He arrived as prime minister. The bluff had worked. Not because Mussolini was unstoppable, because the people who could have stopped him chose not to. Once in power, Mussolini moved carefully at first. He maintained the appearance of constitutional government. He kept the king in place. He allowed other parties to exist nominally. He gave interviews to foreign journalists who went home and wrote admiring profiles. Winston Churchill visited in 1927 and called him a great man. Franklin Roosevelt expressed admiration. He was making the trains run on time. He was building things. He was restoring order. The middle class that had been terrified of socialist revolution breathed out. Beneath the surface, the machinery of dictatorship was assembling itself quietly. Political opponents were arrested, exiled, or killed. The press was brought under control. Editors who printed the wrong things lost their jobs, then their freedom. The secret police, the OVRA, built files on hundreds of thousands of Italians. Local elections were abolished. Trade unions were replaced with fascist corporations that existed to control workers rather than represent them. By 1925, Mussolini had dropped the pretense entirely. He stood up in Parliament and dared anyone to charge him with responsibility for the murder of a socialist deputy named Giacomo Matteotti, who had been kidnapped and killed by fascist agents after giving a speech in Parliament exposing election fraud. Nobody charged him. He was Il Duce now, the leader. The title wasn't officially created, it simply accumulated around him, the way absolute power accumulates when nobody stops it. The cult that formed around Mussolini in the late 1920s and 1930s was one of the most carefully constructed personal mythologies in modern history. He was photographed shirtless harvesting wheat alongside farmers, the virile man of the people. He was photographed piloting planes, the modern man of action. He was photographed with his jaw thrust forward, chin up, eyes fixed on some distant horizon, the Roman emperor reborn. His face appeared on posters everywhere. His sayings were painted on the walls of buildings across Italy. Mussolini is always right. He gave speeches from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome to crowds of hundreds of thousands. He had mastered the theater of power in a way that few leaders before him had attempted. And it worked. For a time, it genuinely worked. Italy in the mid-1930s was, by many measures, a functioning country. Infrastructure was built. The economy grew. The streets were orderly. People who had lived through the chaos of the early 20s were grateful for the stability, willing to overlook the cost. But Mussolini needed more than stability. He needed glory. He invaded Ethiopia in 1935, used poison gas against an army fighting with spears. 1. The League of Nations imposed sanctions. He didn't care. He intervened in the Spanish Civil War, sending troops and equipment to support Franco. He signed the Pact of Steel with Hitler in 1939, binding Italy to Germany's fate. And then, the war came. The real one. Italy's performance in the Second World War was a catastrophe so complete it bordered on the surreal. The military that Mussolini had spent 20 years glorifying, the reborn Roman legions, the fearless warriors of a new empire, collapsed in engagement after engagement. In North Africa, in Greece, where Italian forces were pushed back so badly that Hitler had to intervene to save them. In East Africa, in Russia, where Italian soldiers froze and died in conditions they were never equipped to handle. By 1943, the Allies had landed in Sicily. The war was coming to Italy's doorstep. On July 25, 1943, the Fascist Grand Council, the very body Mussolini had created, voted to remove him from power. 19 votes to 7. The king had him arrested. Mussolini was taken from the meeting and driven away in an ambulance. The most powerful man in Italy for 20 years, taken away in an ambulance, not knowing where he was going. He was imprisoned on an island. then moved to a mountain resort in the Apennines, a location the Allies and the Italian resistance couldn't easily reach. Hitler sent paratroopers to rescue him. They found him sitting in a chair, looking old and gray and diminished. A man who had once commanded crowds of hundreds of thousands, sitting alone in a mountain hotel, waiting to be told what to do. He was taken to northern Italy, where the Germans still held control, and installed as the head of a puppet state, the Italian Social Republic. He gave speeches, he signed death warrants, he wrote memoirs. But the decisions were made in Berlin. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The man who had invented fascism was now a prop in someone else's production. April 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland. He hid in the back of a German military convoy heading for the border. Italian partisans stopped the convoy at a roadblock on Lake Como. They found him. He was wearing a German military coat. He was shaking. He offered money. He offered information. He reportedly asked at one point simply not to be shot in the face. He was shot in the chest. His body, and the body of his mistress, Clara Petacci, who had refused to leave him, were loaded into a van and driven to Milan, to Piazzale Loreto, the same square where, the previous year, 15 Italian partisans had been executed by fascist forces and their bodies left in the street as a warning. The bodies were unloaded and left on the ground. The crowd arrived, did what crowds do. Then someone decided the bodies should be hung upside down from the roof of a gas station so everyone could see. A man who had spent 20 years obsessed with how he appeared, with the careful construction of his image, with the theater of power and the mythology of the leader, ended with his face beaten beyond recognition, hanging upside down from a gas station roof, while strangers spat on him. Mussolini invented something. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of his story. He didn't just seize power, he created a template, the mass rally, the charismatic leader who speaks directly to the people over the heads of institutions, the scapegoating of enemies, the glorification of national greatness, the violence that gets called